going on, my one viewer? Don't really have a major topic. I mean, if you're viewing this, then you're obviously expecting some kind of entertainment, and I could probably entertain you a little bit, but I also might bore you to death. So, I'm not much of an entertainer. I mean, I don't know that many jokes. I don't know really any jokes. I tried to learn a couple jokes for social purposes a while ago, and found that I couldn't remember any of them. And not only that, but my timing is very bad on the jokes themselves, so that didn't really help my cause. Um, so basically, I concluded that I'm just not a very funny person, and that I should refrain from telling jokes. Because I figured if I can't remember the joke, it's probably not going to help me very much when I try to tell it. So, viewer, as you can see, the topic is very vague. Chatting about things really could mean anything. Behind me you can see that I've been following the Olympics, and it looks as though the US is going to lose to Canada in the gold medal game. You might think that a silver medal is not so good. There's a saying in America from the famous movie Talladega Nights: if you're not first, you're last. Or second place is the first loser. And while I agree that you're not technically the winner if you come in second, I think there's been many admirable second places. For example, the United States, second into space. Because really what matters more than where you finish is probably, your trajectory going forward. So for example, even though the United States was second into space, they're first on the moon. So going to space is a big deal. Setting foot on the moon, probably a bigger deal in most respects. I don't know. But like I said, the point is that it looks like the United States is going to lose to Canada and not get the gold medal for hockey. But in other news, there hasn't been a lot of news today. It's been a very slow news day. So another topic that we could talk about is perhaps we could talk about, I think of a good one. Streaming in general. I mean, one thing I've been thinking of is I need to get more prepared for a stream. I've been doing a lot of just stream of consciousness, ad hoc discussions, and it doesn't seem to be very popular. And I can't blame somebody because, if you're gonna pay attention to somebody in a stream, you kind of have a certain expectation, right? So, if you're going to devote your own precious time to watching somebody else present material online, you have a certain expectation that the quality is going to be such and the content is going to be something that is pleasing to you or informative or moves you in some way. um, and to be fair, my own streams have been very, as I say, uh, stream of consciousness, not organized, no real necessary point to them. So while it might be entertaining for me to just ramble on, I think we could reasonably conclude that most people would not enjoy or feel very educated by such an effort. Um, so that's why I think ultimately, if I'm going to do this better, I need to put more effort into the preparation of content, which takes work and effort. Um, but that's what I was doing before I noticed that there was a potential viewer. So I was trying to write like a prepared presentation or an essay, and maybe try to articulate more clearly some kind of message, so that if there was a viewer, it would come across in a more pleasing and more effective style. I did have a viewer earlier today from Argentina, which was pretty cool. Um, they were an aspiring game developer and even had some aspiration to maybe study in the United States. And their English was pretty decent, all things considered. Not perfect, you know, but good. And, so that gives me reason to believe they have a solid chance. They also said they were strong in maths. So I think, my viewer from Argentina could become a United States citizen, or at least come here on a temporary visa. So I mean, my life is I live a very unorthodox style of living. For example, don't really have a career. I suffer from various forms of mental health conditions, which is why I don't have a career, why I'm streaming at 1 o'clock in the morning. I mean, my overall life is not a traditional style of living. And overall, it's very difficult to have mental illness. I would say, my overall opinion is that mental illness is one of the most difficult illnesses to suffer. For one, because you usually are diagnosed or start to deal with the symptoms at a very young age. Number two, there's no real cure to the illness. It's not something that can go into remission or be cleared up by any medication. And number three, there's still a fairly strong stigma around mental illness related to lack of character or potential violence. So as far as the first one, yeah, it's very difficult because, for example, I was diagnosed when I was 17, and being diagnosed that young, it changes your whole trajectory towards the future. Um, for example, it made it difficult for me to initially go to post-secondary schooling. It changed the nature of my relationships at a young age. So it really made it difficult to project my future in the typical, become educated or trained, engage in a career, progress in that career sort of mentality. So, the early diagnosis of a mental illness is one of the reasons why it's such a difficult illness to deal with. Um, and then as far as there being no cure to the illness, you know, that's the chronic nature of mental illness, is that, there is no known cure. I mean, there is, for example, you can take certain medications and become involved in various therapies that help you manage the illness, or maintain some stability in your life. And yeah, to a certain extent, this management of the illness makes it so that you can still engage in relatively normal activities for the most part. Um, but there's no cure, so it's a chronic condition that is you have to deal with for your whole life. And and also a corollary point is that most serious mental illnesses tend to get worse over a period of time. I mean, in my life, as I said, I was diagnosed at 17. I went a good 3 or 4 years without serious incident. And then as I got older, I mean, in 2020, I, had several uh, acute moments. So it's the accelerating difficulty of the illness, the degradation of health is certainly one of the reasons why, it's a terrible disease. And again, the chronic nature, the fact that there's no cure, makes it a difficult illness. And then, yeah, I mean, as far as, you know, I can't even remember what my third point was, but it's part of the illness. I don't know. I mean, I think the third point was the idea that you can't, the stigma associated with it. I mean, and to be fair, there's a lot of movies, and when you look at like the Joker, the movie about Batman's villainous counterpart, and he's kind of a murderously mentally ill person. There's various uh, news pieces talking about the mentally ill. I mean, right now there's the whole Sandy Hook defamation about, or not defamation, but liability lawsuit, where they marketed their guns to unstable or mentally ill people. And and this, all of this collective negativity towards the mentally ill creates an association where once somebody finds out that you have a serious mental illness, they immediately start associating you with these various negative factors and qualities. So yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that the stigma related to mental illness is definitely one of the reasons why it's a terrible disease, and it's a very difficult disease to work with. So I mean, overall, again, as far as physical pain, there are obviously more difficult illnesses, but when you include the comorbidities and the mental traumas, It's certainly one of the more difficult. I mean, because again, you have the early onset factor where most people who have a mental illness become sick at a very young age. Um, you have the fact that there's this huge stigma and darkness associated with mental illness. Um, and then the fact that there's no cure and there's no real light at the end of the tunnel as far as like when you look at a cancer patient or somebody who came down with you know other forms of illness. There's some chance that these things could go into remission or there could be some cure. But the problem is obviously with mental illness there is no cure. So the bottom line is it's a very difficult uh, thing to deal with, and you know I certainly sometimes feel that I don't know. That's just my spiel on mental illness. Um, Trying to think of another topic to chat about. Chatting about things is the topic, and there's such a broad category. Um, Other things that I'm interested in. Um, I did go to school for accounting and finance. Studied a little bit of economics along the way. Um, but that's a very dull topic for the most part. I mean, most people aren't very interested in that. Um, I think when it comes to accounting and finance, obviously everybody's impacted by accounting and finance to some degree. Everybody has to transact uh, to some extent, whether they're talking about grocery shopping or rent or various utilities. And you would think that those transactions would build a desire to understand the fundamentals around business and accounting and finance. Um, but I find that, I mean, yes, everybody has to transact economically more, to a lesser or greater extent, but I find that most people are relatively oblivious to, the fundamental features of finance and accounting, and particularly around uh, money creation with the Federal Reserve and uh, banking institutions. Um, and that hurts people because, well, it doesn't hurt people, but it's a tough thing to have, or it's a negative feature of society that the vast majority of people don't have a thorough understanding of the financial institutions that are the backbone of the economy. Um, I think it's bad because for the primary reason it's bad is it obviously lends a certain shield to those institutions to operate corrosively or corruptively. I think it also, secondly, makes it so that consumers of the financial uh, arena don't really understand how to benefit financially in that arena. And, it also can create, huge inequities in society between those who understand and those who don't. and those who are connected and those who aren't. Um, so as far as the corruption, I mean, the Federal Reserve is primarily responsible for funding federal government deficits. For example, these large stimulus bills uh, were largely funded through the sale of Federal Reserve government bonds. And what this means is that basically, they have legislative authority to create bonds, in order to allow the federal legislator to craft certain programs and stimuluses. Whether that's a good thing or bad thing, it can't be necessarily determined. But it certainly means that there's a huge amount of money in the form of government bonds that pass through the central bank, the Federal Reserve. Now, as far as it being corrupt, I mean, there's no doubt that members of the Federal Reserve have their own financial assets. For example, recently, a few members of the Federal Reserve were found to have traded ahead of stimulus announcements and made rather large profits from those trades. So obviously, trading on inside information from the central bank, that's corruptible in my opinion, and leads to a certain lack of trust. But as I said, and the problem is most people are not necessarily aware of how that affects their immediate life. And, and obviously the major way it affects most people's immediate life is through credit rates, whether that's mortgage rates or auto loans or credit card interest rates, student loans, various forms of credit, commercial loans. And most people, I think, don't really understand the full impact of credit. I think a lot of people desire things like a mortgage or an auto loan, but don't really understand the full amount of interest they're going to be paying on that loan. And this leads to a disconnect where people sometimes, feel like it's a good thing what they're getting, but don't really know how to compare it and contrast it against other forms of finance or other opportunities to reach the good or service that they want. Again, the bottom line is that most people just don't have a really good understanding around banking and finance, which makes them perhaps do things with their finances that are not necessarily in their benefit, like overextending on their purchases on a credit card, or taking on too much student loan for a degree that's not going to pay back the money, or buying too much of a house. People tend to make credit decisions that are not always perfectly rational, because people typically don't totally understand how to value the credit they're being offered, and how to compare it to other forms of finance or financial opportunity. And the biggest problem is that obviously those people who do understand how to properly value credit, and who do have association with banking institutions, central bank and the member banks, these people typically financially do much better than the rest of society. And when I say much better, I mean extremely better. to the point where those people who understand credit decisions have associations with banks, particularly banks that are part of the central bank. These people accumulate wealth at such a disproportionate level. Um, whether you want to look at somebody like Warren Buffett or somebody like Jeff Bezos, somebody like Elon Musk. I mean, these people who have financial literacy, Donald Trump, um, you know, they're able to create wealth at such a higher rate than the typical person who doesn't understand it, that it leads to a large imbalance in society. And yeah, I mean, so the bottom line is that you know the central banking system as it is, not only does it allow for corruption and corrosion at the federal level, it also is complex to the point where most people don't understand it, and contributes heavily to uh, the inequality in society from the people who understand it and have associations with it to the people who don't. So it's a relatively dangerous thing. So I've exhausted my two favorite topics, mental health and finance. I don't know really what else to talk about.